Thank you so much, Jan Emanuel, mainly for organizing this, but everyone, it really is quite an occasion, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And I suppose I'm going to talk about something sort of new and different, that maybe we don't need more measures, but I think we do. Now I see I'm going backwards, hold on. Here we go, okay. Have to get used to this. Okay, anyway, first of all, like John, and I suppose most of us here, we're pretty amazed at how far we've come. And at this event, it really is a wonderful event. I also remember past events where there were many less people, and lots of people called us crazy. And there were two Andrews there, always key, and a Danny and a Richard and everything else. But it really is, it's really exciting to see where the field is. And I think it's particularly beyond anything I imagined in terms of it being not just a really interesting research field, which it is. I mean, I think what's really exciting about it now is it is economics, but it's also psychiatry, medical science, genetics, philosophy, all sorts of fields, psychology, obviously. But also the extent to which it's now become a really interesting, important policy lever, and that we think about well-being now as, you know, there's a range of views on how central it should be to our policy objectives, whether it should be the objective, as I think many of us think it should be, or whether it should be a complementary objective to GNP, which I think the two can go together, or whether, you know, there are still people who are skeptical. I mean, a lot of us in the room are preaching to the converted, but there are also still people out there that think this is completely loopy. So we still have some work to do, I suppose, to convince some people in the world, but I think, in fact, the world is convincing us that well-being really matters. I think COVID made a huge difference, showing us not just that things besides income matter in terms of successful societies and healthy societies, but that things beyond income like mental health and well-being really, really are central. If those things fall apart, your society falls apart very quickly. And unfortunately, I don't know exactly what Andrew's going to say, but I know that the one reason I'm focusing on hope is that I'm seeing it lost in a lot of places and seeing the damage that does. And so I think it really has, you know, as horrible as COVID has been, it's really highlighted the importance of having such tools and such an approach to do what I call is take society's temperature, right? You know, GNP is one example of how what we're producing, not great measure, but it's no measures are perfect. Neither honestly is life satisfaction or our measures, but it's another measure that's really important. It's taking sort of it's really measuring people's well-being rather than just the economy's well-being. Anyway, I won't go into more details. I think John went into it a lot, but I do think one of the key things we still need are widely available national public well-being data. So you know, in the UK, you're really lucky, but if, for example, in the US, they just started measuring ill-being because of fear during COVID. And all of the surveys the official surveys started including reported depression and anxiety. No positive measures. So we've missed really critical years where we really don't know, except through other data sets, if the increases in depression and anxiety were among the same people who are already depressed and anxious, if they were, you know, accompanied by positive measures. In fact, they were. In many cases, life satisfaction stayed relatively stable after a dip, even though people reported more anxiety during a pandemic. Go figure, right? So you really can't understand this unless you measure it right. And so the U.S. is a prime example of why we really missed the boat in really critical years on doing that, and why we should have, you know, data that's public, that's comparable across countries in terms of well-being. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, you know, I think we have right in the sense that we should measure the positive and negative affect and then evaluative measures. We have sort of, I think measuring eudaimonia is really important, even though it tracks very closely with life satisfaction. The whole idea that people without a purpose and meaning in life actually lead really terrible lives. They lead lives of despair, which is, again, why I'm thinking a lot about hope in addition to all the other measures, that if you do, the reason I think hope should be a fourth dimension, along with life satisfaction, eudaimonia, and then positive and negative affect, is that it's one of the most agentic measures of well-being. In other words, hope is not just optimism. There's this, the tragic optimist versus the hopeful pessimist, and it's better to be a hopeful pessimist, or so they say, right? The idea that things may not be good, but you can make them better. And it isn't just they will get better, that it will drop out of the sky that they'll get better, but that you can make them better. And so that entails some sort of agency. It's not sort of the happy peasant kind of finding where very poor people will say they're very happy because it's a survival mechanism. They have no choice. So I've been doing a lot of trying to understand both hope and despair, and seeing the very negative effects of despair, and particularly in the US, where we have a crisis of deaths of despair and premature mortality on the order of, it's up to about 100,000 deaths a year, preventable deaths from suicide, overdose, and alcohol poisoning in the United States. And it used to be, it was considered a white problem. It was sort of the death of the white working class. But in the past couple of years, it's spread to minorities. So all of a sudden, we have more reason to be even more concerned, and the causes are more complex, including, unfortunately, part of that is just the entrance of complex drugs like fentanyl, which have added to the overdose deaths. Part of it is COVID and the additional shocks to society that entail. But in any event, what I'm seeing in terms of large N data, in terms of small scale services, lots of work, I'll talk very quickly about a little about it, is that people that have hope in general just live longer, they do better, they have better health, they have better lives, they live, and a whole host of other things. I've written a paper with Kelsey O'Connor, who's over there, on hope and longevity about 2 years ago, and then I've done some surveys of hope among adolescents and their better educational outcomes with Julia Pozuelo, who's also here, so it is fun to have so many people that you've worked with in the room. But anyway, really quickly, I'm going to skip this slide on method because you know it. Certainly this group does. Let's see if I can get this one. It does not, for some reason it's not moving. Will that work? Got it, I did it that way. Okay. All right, this is a very old finding. It's kind of the U-shaped curve between age and well-being. There's still some debate on it. I'm not going to belabor that debate. Too much time is spent on it. It's so clear in so many kinds of data. There's a U-shape in life satisfaction bottoming out around the middle-age years. There's a hump shape in ill-being, which we are going to hear a lot about, I think also from Andrew, where things like stress, depression, suicide are at the same place where the low is in life satisfaction at their peak and around the same age range for middle-aged people. But one reason to talk about this U-curve is that in the US, for example, where I think despair is the highest, it's not the only place. I think China had with very similar trends for different reasons about 20 years ago. India is now actually a country with a lot of very high rapid income growth and a lot of despair, a lot of suicide, is that despair is the highest in those middle-aged years, and where you see the deaths of despair, where you see premature mortality, people actually taking their own lives, whether it's actively or passively, it's at the bottom of this U. So there are that's where people don't come out of when things are really bad. So one of the things that I did in the course of this research was think about how hope varied across countries and across poor people and rich people. And interestingly enough, in Latin America, which is a very poor, very unequal region, I'm from Latin America, I love it, it's actually a very optimistic region, but you see that the differences between hope for the future are much smaller between the rich and the poor. So poor people have almost as much hope. Sometimes they have more hope than rich people in Latin America than in the US, where it's essentially well-being is as unequally distributed as income is, if not more. So the gaps in well-being, in hope, in reported stress, and all sorts of things are much higher among the poor and the rich in the US than they are in Latin America and many, many other countries. And at the same time, we see that that these same people with lack of hope have very poor markers of objective health, high levels of reported pain, high levels of opioid addiction, and high levels of deaths of despair. So one question obviously is, how does all this work? How does hope affect future outcomes? And I think it's very simple. People who believe in their futures are far more likely to invest in them. And so I'm going to give you some details on my surveys in the next couple of slides. But we've been taking surveys of low-income adolescents, some of this work with Julia in Peru, some work in the US. And we see that low-income adolescents who are young adults who are at a very critical moment in their lives where they can invest in their futures, in their future education, or in their health, or they can undertake risky behaviors, they can drop out of school, they sort of choose they're at a critical point in their lives. And we see that kids with hope really do better. They not only do they say they can do better and they will do better, but when we go back several years later, they are doing better. And we're comparing people that have not a lot of means. And it's not just, the wealthy ones getting ahead. This is all among low-income adolescents. There are other examples in other data. One is, unfortunately, just across groups, racial groups in the US. And if you can see this, the odds of being higher up on an optimism or hope ladder where poor blacks are the most, these are across poor income cohorts. Poor blacks are 3 times as likely than poor whites in the US to be hopeful about the future and to be optimistic. And if you think about it, you're talking about the group that's had historically the most discrimination, the most difficulty, that still has worse outcomes on lots of objective measures, and yet they're more hopeful. And what we also see is that the gaps between, say, education attainment, health, and even marriage rates are getting narrowed. In other words, poor blacks are doing better and poor whites are doing worse. And so these metrics are reflected in actual objective outcomes. And they're the most, I think the most obviously reflected in deaths of despair. So this is a slide from Case and Deaton, and these are several wealthy countries, and the very top red line is US whites only, and that's mortality rate, right? So it's the only group, the only country where a major social group is losing life expectancy rather than gaining it. This is pre-COVID. And then you see the dark blue line in the middle of the slide, that's US Hispanics. And if we had there was a line for US African Americans, it would also be going down along with the other countries. So all of a sudden, a social group in the US, it's unprecedented. All of a sudden, completely reverses our entire life expectancy rate due to what are deaths of despair. So if that's not a sign that hope matters, I'm not sure what is. And then, of course, you have the COVID shock. This is some analysis we did from first responder data, and we did this before the CDC released the final death data on overdose deaths, and we actually predicts it just as well. It's what first responders around the country have been answering calls for: suicide, overdose. This one is overdoses. And as you see, there's a huge uptick in overdoses. There were 90,000 deaths from overdose alone in the US in 2020. That was a 30% increase from 70-some thousand, which is not a low number, in 2019. So COVID did indeed induce a shock. Interestingly enough, though, here you go during COVID. I didn't really believe this was real, but I've seen it now in many different surveys. This is a survey we did with WashU. And these are racial differences, and here you have the being optimistic for about life in 5 years, and this is reported stress. And as you can see, the most optimistic group by far are low-income blacks. Yet again, even though they got hit hardest by COVID, and the least stressed group are low-income blacks. And just quickly, this is not a Pollyanna finding. This isn't people that just think everything's rosy because that's the only way to survive. The same poor black respondents who are optimistic say their city is not a good place to live. They say their financial situation is bad. So there are lots of reality tests. It isn't just sort of a reporting thing, right? Okay, I'm almost out of time here, so very quickly. All right, so one of the things, just two more quick slides. One is this idea that hope, this is a quote from Amanda Gorman, the wonderful inaugural poet during the 2021 inauguration. Hope is not a promise we give, it's a promise we live. And there's the idea that there's something about, it isn't just, and I think it's that people have agency to make their life better, or they think they do, and that's part of having it, right? That you can try and make things better. And I think it's missing a bit in the discussion of well-being, not totally, but it's just that actually that you can actively do things to make your life better. This isn't about how to be happy. It's just that if you strive for a better life, for a purposeful and meaningful life, you see that in the metrics, that people just have better lives. And whether it's doing that through altruism, as John had just showed, or whether it's doing it through other means, it's just the idea that you have a reason to get up and out of bed and not just, do things for yourself, but maybe give back, be a part of something, a community, a world, whatever it might be. So anyway, one of the things I realized digging into this a bit more is that hope is understudied. So psychiatrists say that it's very critical to say recovery from mental illness, but there's not very much written about hope. And then another thing about it is that it's a trait. So yes, in the same way that part of well-being is genetic, right? Some of it we can't explain. It just comes with you with biological, for genes, all sorts of things. You do inherit personality traits, but they can also be developed and learned. And I think Jim Heckman has done a lot of good recent work on this, showing that socio-emotional skills and other kinds of so-called soft skills can be learned, and they can be learned much later in life than the kind of skills that make up IQ. So I think that's another reason to invest in it and think about it, because it is something people can do and change. And often that maybe policy can help them do and change. And as I said before, not having hope is linked to a lot of very bad outcomes. And I think we're going to hear about trouble and bad outcomes more from Andrew. Last very quick slide. We did a couple of pilot surveys where we basically asked, we started in Peru with Julia, and then I did some in the US, where we asked young adults, high school graduates of the next year, about their future aspirations for their future education, their trust in others, a whole battery of questions. It was called the Thinking About the Future project. And what we found is the first round was among very poor kids in Lima, Peru, in a neighborhood where it's half running water and electricity and pavement and half dirt, still dirt roads and piped in, water from trucks and tapped in electricity. And out of initially we had 400 respondents. Out of those, 85% of the respondents said they wanted to go to college or grad school. That was their expectation for education. Not one of their parents had gone to college. And yet, when we went back 3 years later, almost all of them were on track to meet those expectations. They were in school. This isn't easy for people who have to forego income to stay in school. I mean, there's publicly available education, but it's still a sacrifice if you're poor. And we also found that the aspirations were very persistent within individuals over time. So people with high aspirations tend to sort of stick to it. I think we have a lot more to learn about why that is and what we can do to support it, particularly in people who don't have high aspirations. But I think there's something really there. And then very quickly, in the US, which is a much less happy story, we interviewed both poor African-American kids and poor white kids in Missouri, which is like it's sort of right in the middle of the US. It borders on 8 states. And what we see is that the poor African-American kids all have high education aspirations. They have higher trust in others. They have a mentor, somebody in their community or their family that supports them. Could be a parent, could be a grandparent, but somebody. And they're conditional on graduating high school. The poor black kids in my survey are much more likely to pursue college than the poor white kids, even though the poor white kids are less materially deprived. And the vision that the poor white kids have, unfortunately, I think it says a lot about the US today, It's very self-reliant vision. I can do it. They don't trust other people. Their parents don't want them to go to college. Their parents are skeptical of college the way there's a huge skepticism of science in the US now among certain groups, and it's become very ideological. But most importantly, they don't have hope. They don't have a vision that their future can be better. It's just not in their language. It's not in their discussion. It's not the way their parents feel. And you think about that and you wonder how, this is going to be the next generation in despair. They're not going to have the tools to make it in tomorrow's labor markets. And I think it's, the US is an extreme case, but I think it's something we have to think about a lot, particularly as, the well-being of the next generation is really important. And I think, we really need to think about that in many other countries besides the United States. And I will stop because I've gone on too long. I do have some ideas about how we can do that, but I'll try and answer that in the questions, or you can read the book, which will soon be out.
What do you see as the correlation or relationship between hope and purpose?
I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it's probably pretty high. I mean, they sort of fall along the same dimensions of well-being, or the same direction, and a lot of the same determinants. I guess purpose is a bit more specific, and so probably, particularly among younger people, low-income people who don't quite have, they don't quite know how they're going to get ahead, but they're determined to do it. They may, I don't know if it's a less well-defined purpose, let's say, but I would think they're very similar.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. Could you say a little bit more about perhaps the link between hope and resilience, both in terms of understanding resilience as it is, but also in terms of promoting resilience in the future?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part. It was hope and resilience?
Hope and resilience. So perhaps as a way of understanding why some people are more resilient than others, but also perhaps as a function of developing interventions around hope that would promote more resilience.
Right. I've certainly thought a lot about hope and resilience, and in fact, our kids in Peru in the survey are really, every single one of our hopeful kids has had a negative shock. They have not been sick themselves. That's much more difficult. So if you lose your health, you lose a lot of your agency, but other than that, people are amazingly resilient. And I've seen resilience among poor populations everywhere. Before I studied the US in so much detail, which is much more depressing, I worked much more in developing countries, and I'm from Peru. And I found that the resilience of the poor was always something that really stood out. So I think the one thing that maybe or that separates hope from resilience is that hope maybe is the vision and resilience is the doing, right? So resilience is that you get through things even though it's difficult, but if you keep hope, you keep up sort of the sense that things will be better. I don't fully know. I think they go together well. I think they reinforce each other, as you say. I'm not sure they're completely separable concepts either.
I wanted to ask about whether there were any sex differences in the adolescent data, and in particular whether you've looked at, one of the things we're finding is happiness with appearance is very predictive of poor well-being for girls during the adolescent years. And I wondered if you'd looked at that at all with your data sets.
I did not, but you said happiness with appearance. Yeah, I can see that, and I think isn't that also there's some evidence that's sort of exacerbated by social media that that it's kind of this self-image thing. We did in our surveys were really more plain Jane about education, relations with parents and others. We found that one thing that really mattered to adolescents was having a mentor, having somebody that supported them in their aspirations. What was really amazing about the Peru surveys was that these parents who had never been to college, like the poor white parents in the US, but the parents in Peru all wanted their children to do better than they. It was like drummed into the culture of the country and of the adolescents, right? And in the US, you're getting the reverse. And the difference between not just African Americans, all minorities and whites stands out along those lines too, that there's much more of a community around minorities, much more family ties, community ties, informal family ties. We're not talking about the Ozzie and Harriet perfect family. A lot of our African American respondents only had one parent in the household, right? The parent had died or left or something. You know, this isn't the sort of, oh, it's the perfect marriage that makes kids, you know, have high aspirations. It was more that they had somebody they could trust. And that also showed up in just higher levels of reported trust among the minority adolescents. I mean, they even said their neighborhoods weren't safe, but they felt that they could trust other people. Again, you know, so these aren't Pollyanna findings. They know they live in difficult situations, and yet they have ways to get through them, right? And maybe that's resilience. A last question? Wherever the microphone goes, I don't control that.
Hi, Carol. I'm Claire from RWJF.
Okay.
We haven't met in person. Great to see
Yes.
you. Thanks for this overview. Is social connectedness different than hope? Because you see in African American communities in the U.S., as you just said, are deeply involved in the church or a faith community, which is social connectedness. So is that what hope is? Just a slightly different framing?
I don't think they're the exact same thing. I think they certainly reinforce each other. I think it's much more difficult to be hopeful about the future if you think it's just you battling the world. And the vision that unfortunately the American dream, you know, you work hard, you get ahead, you fall behind, you're a loser, you don't, you know, if you're poor, you deserve it, you don't deserve social support, is a very lonely vision that worked very well when there was a lot of stability and stable jobs, and you got a stable blue-collar job, and you were roughly middle class, and you had a, you know, stable family, and all of a sudden, the informal safety nets and communities that minorities had to form to survive because the system didn't work so well for them, right, has become an incredibly protective factor. And I think I don't think social connectedness and hope are the exact same thing, but I think they reinforce each other. And if you're growing up and you're going into an uncertain world and you have social connections, again, whether it's your family or your community, it's going to help you, meet your aspirations, and it's going to help you if you fall behind. And people fall behind, but you don't fall without a parachute, so to speak.